All
All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Damien Barrett. This is Ben Greisler. We'll introduce ourselves a little bit more in detail later on, but I wanted to start, like I start most of my presentations, with a joke. Before you do any kind of presentation, I learned a long time ago, about a minute before you start, is to just be self-centered. And I go, nice big breath, calm, relaxed. That's how I prepare. How do you prepare, Ben?
I'm good.
So we're making fun of it, but in all honesty, Ben and I have been friends for almost 20 years, and we have different styles. We co-presented earlier in the week, very different style than what today will be. All right, so I'm Damien Barrett. Who am I? I have been in education for a really long time. Started in 2008 at a private school, but before that, I was a school teacher in Michigan. I also worked at FIT in Manhattan. Spent 13 years in K-12, and now for the past 2 years have been in corporate. I'm going to try very hard in this presentation not to say the name of my company. If I slip up, you didn't hear it, because I am presenting as a Mac admin at a Fortune 500, not a Mac admin at blank company name. So, Ben, how about yourself?
So I'm an IT consultant, have been for approaching 25 years now, and I first met Damien at FIT when working as a consultant. I was hired by Apple as a third-party provider to do some work for FIT. I later bumped into Damien again at a private school that he was working at, and we've just been bumping into each other throughout our careers. And we actually think we probably met even before the FIT gig, but we're not 100%.
See, when you get as old as we do, the memory starts to go.
Yeah.
I have vague, dim
I'm not even sure what we're
of,
doing here, so I'm just
vague,
going by the slides.
vague, dim, hazy memories of O'Reilly OS 10 Con, like 2002.
Yeah.
Might have been there.
Probably.
We're not sure. Maybe it was Macworld or possibly
Could be.
WWDC.
Yeah. But so I've seen with my work, I've done a lot of work for EDU, both K-12 and higher ed, but also a lot of enterprise work. So we thought this was a good opportunity. This is, Damien's going to be taking the lead, but have that view on kind of both sides, and what can we learn from it?
So from education to enterprise, what the bleep have we done? Yeah, humorous title. It's also true. But what's even more true than this, me going, what on earth have I done as I spend 2 years in corporate? It's also the bleep that we have done, okay? And we're gonna talk about both aspects today. I'll issue it again. Disclaimer, I am not here representing my company, but I am representing the idea of Fortune 500s, all of which more or less are run the same way from an IT organizational structure. Any disclaimers?
I'm here for myself.
Okay. All right.
I'll tell you all about my company if you want to listen.
Okay. So we did intros. If you have any questions afterwards, come on up, and I'll tell you in great detail more about it. So 1996 called, right? We're going way, way, way back. It wants its pleated khakis back because in 1996, I was a public school teacher. And if you look really carefully on the background, there's a tool. One of my favorite quotes, because we're talking about long time ago. Does anybody know who wrote this quote, or who said this quote? If you really look closely, most overnight successes took a long time. Anybody know that one? It's 100% true. Steve Jobs. This was one of Steve Jobs' maxims. He brought it to Apple, and he had a great amount of success with it. I think it's true in both education and enterprise. It is particularly true in enterprise. Things take a lot longer, orders of magnitude longer, to make change. Let's find out who's here. Education admins, raise your hand. Probably about 20. Okay. Enterprise corporate admins, 5 or 6, 7. Anybody else? Government, military,
Consultants?
Consultants? Okay. Let's talk about organizational structure of education. Why are we doing this, right? Well, in most K-12s, including the one I worked in, my organizational structure was, hey, my boss, can I do this thing? It was either a yes or a no, or it was a why, and it was usually a yes. You have other aspects of educational leadership you have to worry about in a K-12. You have to worry about your users. You have to worry about how something that you're doing in your fleet management may impact the teachers, or the teachers running their classrooms. And sometimes you have to worry about the superintendent or the school board. Maybe you made a decision about a piece of software or a particular piece of hardware that gets rolled out that conflicts with something that a person on the school board wanted to have happen. And so they start making noise and undercutting you.
Has that happened to anybody here? Really? Surprised.
I mean, an example would be maybe you have a corporate school board member who works for IBM, and you've just recommended that we go to completely to Apple. It's happened.
I've seen that happen. HP in this case.
HP.
Yeah.
In fact, we were using a vendor at my corporate, and it's not just education, we were using a vendor at my corporate job now we are no longer using. And the only reason we're using that vendor is because there was a single person in the company who made that decision and pushed it through. Higher ed structure. There is no order, right? Who's in higher ed? True or not true? Right? It's kind of funny, right? Right? Recovering from higher ed. Recovering from higher ed. Right? Recovering from higher ed.
My
right?
name is.
I actually went and looked. I went tried to find a graphic for made sense for higher ed, and I couldn't find one because the structures are so different between schools. I couldn't find one that made any sense for everybody. So I thought, well, all right, I'm going to grab a graphic that kind of makes a joke and makes a point. So
Yeah, when I saw this slide with my experience working with higher ed, I'm like, oh, this is spot on. Because this person's this school, that person's that school, this person is the administration. I mean, it's just like all over the place. Everybody has their own silos and worlds, and if there's anything that crosses, it might be the network team, and then they're just like on their own pedestal somewhere. So
I want to spend a little bit more time talking about this. I think a lot of you here are in education. You're looking maybe to move into enterprise, so I'm going to spend quite a bit more time talking about the organizational structure in enterprise. I want to specifically talk about siloing. I have not yet met a Fortune 500 that doesn't have silos, where you have people working in their own little groups who do not communicate with other groups, sometimes because the organizational structure doesn't allow it, sometimes because they don't know where their allies are, where their champions are. It's a great graphic. You can see that in this case, we've got some people working over here in the corner. They're isolated. I sit in one of those seats right now, behind the green arc. But I have been able to figure out how to break out of that green arc, because I've been forward enough to go out and say, hey, I need to, hey supervisor, I need to make this change. And so I'm breaking down that green arc wall and making those black communication channels happen in order to effect change at the company. Okay. This is an example I graded out because this is actually our current organizational structure, and you'll see that I'm way down here, right? And so I have several levels to go before we get to anybody who might be able to make a senior leadership decision. Now, some of that's by design, some of that's because of the size of the company. But I wanted to point out that you need to be able to navigate and study this organizational structure in order to effect that change. For the first 6 months I worked at the company, I opened the org chart every single day, and I studied it. Who reports to who? I'd click on an administrator or a senior leadership's profile, and I would read, what they do for the company. Who do they report to? What are their experiences? How long have they been with the company? Where have their successes been that they've put on their own public profile? Well, public within our company profile. Then trying to find who those allies and those champions are to make the change that I wanted to see happen. Study the org chart. Let's talk about jargon. I started at my company, and I was immediately met with a wall of jargon and acronyms and things that I'm like, what on earth does CMS mean? What does CLT mean? What does ITEX mean? I had no idea, and I didn't have anybody I could ask. I mean, if I felt brave enough, I could ask my supervisor, but I didn't because I was brand new. I started to figure it out. How? I started reaching out to other people around me, other people at my level, and saying, hey, what's this mean? And then they would they would tell me. I'm like, that still doesn't make any sense. You gotta explain this to me and tell me what they're doing.
So one thing that I've seen, because I bounced back and forth between education, enterprise, and higher ed, and K-12, and stuff like that, is there really is their own tranches of jargon, and having to learn all of those things. I mean, the first time I walked into like K-12, and they were talking about their SIS, and I had to like integrate something, or whatever. I'm like, what's SIS?
Right.
And you know, if you're going to move between it, that is almost a foundational piece, is to figure out a way of figuring out what the heck this all means. And most of the time, we're smart enough in here to just be like, oh, okay, your database for people, got it.
It's true that there's an XKCD comic for everything. I found one for jargon. I'm not gonna read the whole thing, but you can look at one or two of them. You know, transjugular, intraheptic, porta systems, shunt replacement, right? So I work in an industry that's highly technical. We have lots and lots of very interesting and high-end art research and development happening. And sometimes I'll go work with an end user who's a scientist. And I'm a fairly smart guy, but these people they're a whole nother level. And I'll end up talking to them, and of course they immediately go to their, you know, their jargon of their industry. I'm like, hold on. let's slow down, explain to me what you're doing. And that's been fascinating, by the way, talking to these scientists and learning what they're doing and some of the things they're working on. But that jargon's everywhere, including education.
So just a quick question. Has anybody here run into situations where actually the jargon, which usually comes up as a way of making sure language is very specific, that's the point of jargon, but it actually got in the way of what you were trying to achieve? Have you ever run into situations like that? Chris? Yeah, a couple of hands. I think sometimes we're afraid to admit that, quite honestly. Or we've figured it out, but how many times have you run into a situation where it took you longer to kind of figure something out because you didn't want to ask?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a little more.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's hard,
That's
right?
closer to what I figured. All right.
It's hard to ask.
Yeah.
Because you're admitting you don't really know something.
We're supposed to be the experts.
Yeah.
We got to learn too.
Here's a fun one. How many years did you say sudo before you said sudo? Because you read it before you heard it.
How many people just went, I still call it that?
And of course, it's right. So it's super user do. But if you're reading it in a Unix manual or an OS 10 manual, it's sudo. Well, no, it's sudo. So there we go. That's a little tiny example of jargon in our own little industry.
Yeah.
Acronyms. I mentioned a few of them already. They are everywhere. And I found this post on Reddit. I thought this is a great example. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it is, corporate mumbo jumbo sometimes. Sometimes there's an acronym just for there to be an acronym. Yep. No other reason.
Quick question. For those of you who have been kind of in both sides, have you ever thought to yourself and go, I see more of this on one or the other? Acronyms, TLAs, jargon, that type of thing. Is one side tend to be more than the other? Just yes or no kind of thing? No. Okay.
I would, in my view, it's more in corporate. Not that education doesn't have its own set of jargon, but I'm definitely, it also might be the size of the company I'm at. Let's do the catch box.
Oh, God. Well, this could be just, here, somebody take this and...
Baseball baseball 101 for.
I just see flying coffee cups, death, destruction, fires.
Just to add to it real quick, like I think it depends on the size of. So I went from education to corporate, and I think it depends on the size of the university that you might work for. In my instance, I worked central IT for 9 separate colleges, so I had to know about 800 unique applications, and I had to talk to 9 different colleges, and then the business unit side of things as well.
You guys remember remember that graphic I showed you of higher ed, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's just it, though, is like, I think it's, for me at least, it's about equal, but that's also because I had essentially an enterprise level size university that had all these, you know, you were talking about ARC and you know, all that stuff. That existed in my previous life as well. So, yeah, I just wanted to put that antidote out there, I guess.
So I'll summarize what you said. It might be the size of the organization that matters more than anything else.
And I think that, I guess that's what I was kind of getting at, is like, if you work in higher ed at an enterprise scale, an enterprise level, I think that's where we have the same org chart, if you will, where like it took me 6 layers to like convince someone to buy me MDM, and it took forever. Like, you put in the higher ed pace of things, but then you also put in 6 layers of org structure, and like, so yeah, it might be a little easier in K-12 just sometimes because it's a little smaller than some universities and stuff like that.
The other thing I want to highlight on the slide is this one sentence here about halfway down the second paragraph. This person says, I use plain language to try to stay away from the cliches and definitely try to use the correct words for things. I started doing that. When I first started there, I was seeing a lot of this. As long as you make sure we collaborate beyond boundaries, share accountability, and apply enterprise thinking by streamlining our processes to increase synergies, eliminate redundancies, and drive out-of-the-box innovation. That says nothing, right? This is corporate, in my view, corporate ladder climb speak. And it was everywhere around me. I'm like, well, I don't actually have any particular interest in climbing the corporate ladder. I'm here to be a change agent, to bring platform agnostic IT to the company. I stopped doing that because I was immersed in this. I was like, nope. So I started using more plain language, and I've had a lot more success in the past 12 months than I did the first 12 months because I speak plainly, and people are starting to go, oh, okay, right? I'm going to buy into what you're selling. That's the other half of working for a corporation, pushing the onus off on someone else, right? We just shuffle responsibility back and forth, and we're always busy doing nearly nothing some days. Unfortunately, this is true, even in this unusual work environment and employment environment. There are still people doing not a whole lot. And that may be true for education too, but in this case, I'm going to talk specifically about corporate. Let's talk to the audience for a minute. Oh yeah, I didn't put a slide up. So some of the examples of jargon that I've seen in schools. How many of you work in a school where you call your students scholars? No, I've definitely seen it. How about friends? Yep, sure, at the elementary level, right?
Everyone's a friend.
Yep, everyone's a friend. And I'm okay with that one personally. Scholar, I don't know. To me personally, I can only talk about my own opinions, just feels, right? What's wrong with student? It's a perfectly gender neutral, normal term. But somebody somewhere took that corporate mumbo jumbo, and they applied it to the education environment to try to, I don't know, make it look different? I don't know.
So my favorite is, because I do training for people, and in one of the groups I do training for, we are no longer instructors. We are no longer teachers. We are facilitators, which honestly I thought was a little demeaning, because I want to think of myself as an educator or a teacher. I'm here to teach, not just simply to facilitate. But the edict was sent down. We are now facilitators.
Does anybody have another example that they've seen? You got the box right there. Yep.
Has anyone else ever been told you can't have engineer in your title because you don't, engineer anything. Like,
Oh,
that
that's
kind of-
interesting.
So again, I had a college of engineering, and
Huh.
like on campus, like IT and other not people in engineering weren't allowed to have engineer in the title because you're not an engineer kind of thing, and like that was also very demeaning. And
Well, I appreciate that because I worked for a publishing company and we had a sales engineer. And as somebody who actually has a degree in engineering, I actually kind of bristled at that because there was like,
What? Sales
we
engineer.
sold repair information. It wasn't even anything super technical. So I can see
So-
that both ways.
I've got a couple slides later on where we're going to talk specifically about weird job titles. But we're going to move on and talk about some of the jargon that I've seen in corporate world. SAM does not mean Seattle Art Museum. It means software asset management. So what on earth is software asset management? So again, I was coming from education, moving into corporate, and I'm immediately presented with SAM forms. Like, what is this? What am I doing with this? So here's the thing. If you've got 33,000 endpoints, you can't just make a change without any kind of approval. That change has to be vetted.
Well,
Fine.
you could.
Well, in the corporate world, we call that a career limiting move, is
Yeah.
what we call that. You could, please don't, you push it through the software asset management process. And here's why. That small change that you're making could affect every single one of those endpoints
Yep.
and then cause significant downtime for the end user. And so it has to be vetted by legal, end users, employee experience, procurement, financing. I'm going through my own SAM process right now. It's significant, and it can take I started this topic talking about how long things take. This takes a very long time. There is an open source piece of software called Office Reset. Oh, hold on, I'll get back to that. Called Office Reset. It's from Paul Bowden, who is one of the programmers on the Microsoft Office suite. And all it is a set of scripts that remove, like, I want to reset Teams. And so it goes through and resets all of the things related to Teams. Very simple software. It took 6 months for me to get that approved at my company. 6 months before I could push that out to my relatively small set of Macs in my fleet. Other things we need to talk about related to software asset management. Fines from the Business Software Alliance. These are no joke. If
Anybody
you-
had to deal with that? Just curious.
It's not
Couple of
as much of an
months,
issue as it used to be because companies have figured out better licensing models and better licensing controls. But if your company, particularly if you're a corporation, and you're caught using software that you are not licensed to use, the fines can be exorbitant. $100,000, $250,000 per instance sometimes. So the SAM process protects that. If we have 10,000 licenses of Microsoft Office and we put it on 11,000 machines, that could be a significant fine from the BSA.
Everybody has fully licensed fonts, right? Right?
If you don't, you need to have them, particularly if you're a corporation, because corporations have deep pockets. And lawyers know that corporations have deep pockets, and they're going to come after you for that. And you're going to piss off your legal department. And that is another career limiting move. Go buy the book. As hard as it is, go buy the book. You have to worry about compatibility with operating system updates and upgrades. Thank you, Apple, for the yearly release cycle. I'm being sarcastic. It makes our jobs a little bit harder, even while I recognize that they are continuing to advance the operating system, all for the better. But it makes our jobs a lot harder, particularly when you're talking about 6 to 12 month SAM and change management process reviews. If you are deploying open source software, as we do at my company, this also has to be vetted by not just legal and finance and end user services and iTechs, but also by our multi-cloud and toolchain group, the people who are developing software within our company. They have to vet the software. because they're looking for things like supply chain attacks or vulnerabilities inside that software that may expose the company to litigation or an example of litigation would be if you use this open source piece of software to generate a product or a protected process, and the open source license agreement for that software doesn't allow that, you could then be sued for that. I'll let you talk about this one.
Oh, yeah. So how many people here were like really, really jazzed that Apple started to develop an implementation of ZFS? That was like super exciting, right? Where is it now? It's not in Mac OS anymore. And why is that? Open source licensing issues and such, and there's a bunch of stuff that got pulled out of Mac OS due to open source licensing concerns. And I'm pretty sure that if you could actually go back and talk to the engineers at Apple, you would get agreement that, yeah, we really miss this stuff, but our hands were tied. We had to give it up. So that is something that we need to be aware of. Now, granted, this is not specifically enterprise or education because it can cross both, but it's a consideration that I expect my tools to keep being there, and sometimes they're not. And you have to understand why, and you have to maybe even predict stuff. So.
I mean, there's been an example of a tool that's about to be removed from Sonoma, Audit D. The word on the street is it will be gone relatively soon. Well, I don't know about you guys, we still have threat management and cybersecurity tools on our fleet that use Audit D for that reporting. And currently, the framework that Apple's developing to replace that does not have all of the same capabilities as Audit D. And so as the platform architect and engineer, I have to go, hey, Apple, please don't remove this until you've got a replacement that has parity. And if that ends up not being parity, if that parity doesn't exist when Sonoma was released on day one, I'm then going to have to either not deploy Sonoma, or I'm going to have to find a replacement tool, which then is a 6 to 12 month process through software asset management and vetting and change management.
So feedback.apple.com, Appleseed for IT, the Appleseed Slack channel, and then the super special secret offshoot of that. Come talk to me if you need to know about that. These are all places that you get to communicate back to Apple to go, you might want to think about this at varying levels of
Essentially,
success.
give us another 12 months of useful Audit D, and then the issue becomes moot.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. I actually wrote it down. There's my SAM process. Security, finance, endpoint, legal, procurement. Okay? Is the process we go through for SAM. What the F is change management? I actually asked my boss this. I showed up and he's like, I said, hey, I want to make this change to the fleet. And he said, you got to push it through change management. And I'm like, huh? What?
So, quick question. How many people in education have a specific change management group that deals with it? Handful. Okay.
Change management is the controlled identification and implementation of required changes within a computer system or organization. Yeah, okay. Let's simplify that. If you're making a change to a fleet of computers, that change has to have a back out procedure. So if it doesn't work, you need to be able to back it out, which is fun for some of Apple's software updates because sometimes you can't back them out. And I've had to write some exceptions for those for our change management system. It needs to have a recovery plan, same kind of thing. And it needs to be tested. You have to have a testing cycle. And so I need to have tested my change several weeks to several months before I actually push the button to make the change. So if you're working with a fleet of machines and you don't have several test machines set up next to on your desk, or multiple VMs in UTM or Parallels or whatever, start doing that, because that's how you're going to better streamline your own change management process. Why do we do it? Because you could affect 30,000 machines. You could cause massive productivity loss. you could actually cause, in our case, has not happened in a long time, and it's not related to me, but it could actually cause our manufacturing lines to shut down. And then the company's losing money because they're not able to produce the product. And they're losing a lot of money. So that change management process is very, very important in corporate and enterprise and manufacturing.
And even in education, make a mistake, you may have rooms full of students not being able to gain everything that they can from the education experience.
All right. So I mentioned quickly, this is Paul Bowden's office reset. Took 6 months for me to get that. Now, hold on. This was the first one I did. So this was me learning the process. So maybe it took a little bit longer than it would have normally, but still took 6 months. We have read-only Fridays. What does that mean? In corporate world, nothing really happens on the weekends. It just doesn't. I don't know why. We don't make any changes on Fridays. I don't have any meetings on Fridays. Nobody schedules meetings on Fridays. I think it's because we sometimes don't have the coverage over the weekend. So if a change is made and something blows up, the coverage isn't there. So
On the flip side, though, for those of you on education, when do you tend to push things? Yeah, maintenance window. Yeah. So this is a case where if we're comparing and contrasting EDU and enterprise, it's almost completely flipped.
yeah, we don't make changes on weekends or Fridays. It's almost always it's a Monday morning. And every time I've seen it so far. This was new to me. We're a multinational company. We have 150 locations around the world. And we have other workers that I work with who live in other countries with very different holiday schedules. And our company publishes a calendar. And I actually meant to put a screenshot of it up there, but I decided it had too much proprietary information on it, like where I worked. So I didn't put it up there. There are some very interesting holidays in Asia that I just didn't know about. And those are days that those people have off. And so alongside the multinational holidays, you have to plan around that. You also have to plan around time zone differences, right? And the number of times I've ended up staying up until 11 o'clock or midnight so I could talk to somebody in Shanghai or Singapore because they're 12 hours difference or 11 hours difference, that's happened multiple times.
Now, I ran into an interesting situation. So I'm an American helping consult with a Japanese IT firm owned by a Canadian, and we support a number of international schools, Germany and a few other places. That is like the one time ever in almost 25 years I've run into the same situation that we always consider with multinational enterprise. Had to deal with that with a school because we had basically like 4 holiday structures overlie the one thing. But that was kind of an edge case. But it can happen.
Also something I ran into when I started there. In education, I had a relatively loose, open structure. If I wanted to make a change that affected security, generally wasn't a big issue. In corporate, this is a huge, huge, huge issue. Security is driving the bus, period. And you're either on that bus or you're left behind. And so our InfoSec and our cybersecurity people, they are in charge and in control. And everything I do has to be vetted by them, whether it be a software asset management change or a change management process. And there are reasons for that. We use tools like Zscaler or other proxies. All the traffic coming to and from a laptop owned by our company is monitored, every single bit. We do deep packet inspection to make sure that we don't have an attempted hijacking of data. VPNs and firewalls everywhere. If you go to our research and design center, which is 2 million square feet, we have another VPN that you have to sign into after you sign into the first VPN. Because that's how they design the network structure there, because there's so much protected data in that facility.
I'm sure it's screaming performance.
It's not. I wish I could say, but it's not. But it's functional.
When you
And
sign
it-
in, does it
and-
go do 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 as it dials?
Yeah, the modem sounds, yeah. It's functional, but more importantly, it's protected. And it's vital, it's key. I've been looking for a while at tools like Collide and Upticks because I want that OS query based heuristics and telemetry. I want to be able to collect that data and send it to our cyber team. So I've been vetting those for over a year now, and I'm putting together a proposal right now to purchase Collide. But ask me again in 12 months because how long do things take? A very long time. We use a SIM. A SIM is a data collection tool. We send all of our Jamf Pro data to Splunk for analysis. And then they look at conditional access rules and is this device compliant or not? And then we can flip a switch and make that device non-compliant immediately. It happens automatically. Solutions like semantic DEP, which endpoint protection solutions. We have EDR tools like CrowdStrike, and SentinelOne, and Carbon Black. Right, more tools for endpoint management and security. And there are tools like Encase, that's a forensics tool, because like it or not, when you're a big company, you can become a target. And if one of your devices gets compromised, Windows or Mac, you need to have a way to do a professional forensics analysis on that device. Encase is a great example of that.
Anybody on the, because that's pretty standard corporate stuff, anybody on the education side have to get involved with forensics? The stuff that happened? A few hands, yeah. So we're starting to see things that had traditionally maybe just really been a concern over here, but they're kind of sliding over, crossing all barriers. So,
now, as the endpoint administrator, am I doing the forensics analysis on that machine? No. We have a team that's a critical response team that's specifically trained to do those forensics analysis because that might end up in a litigation case. Has to be able to be, provable in a court of law, I guess. Okay. And there are DLP solutions as well to help for endpoint analysis. Education. This happened. This happened. He might have been 13, but a 12-year-old just penetrated your firewall, pen tested your firewall. How did we know? We were running a NID solution, network intrusion detection system, that picked up this unusual traffic coming from this 12-year-old's laptop. We shut it down immediately, pulled him in and said, what are you doing? Turned out he was the son of the head of cybersecurity for the United Nations and was trying to be like his dad. Yeah, it was a fun conversation because I'm sitting across from this guy who's ex-Mossad explaining like, this is what your son has been doing. It ended okay, but it was unusual.
So now one of the things that I've seen, kind of sensed, is this kind of clumsy testing of systems seems to come a lot more from EDU. Kids just being curious. Yeah. And your average person working at a corporation, they're not trying to do this kind of stuff. But kids, you've just told them to sit in a room for 8 hours or 7.5 hours or whatever. They get bored. They've been watching YouTube. They're reading. They're really smart. This is their life. And they keep trying to do this stuff. The question is, what do you do with them after the fact? My school district, they basically expelled a kid because he was smart enough to look under the keyboard of his teacher where the credentials were and got into the system. Right. And personally, I think that he shouldn't have been expelled. He should have been like, this was a really bad choice. Don't do this kind of thing. But if you're interested, we maybe have some things we can help you out with. And the teacher probably should have been, I don't think anything happened to the teacher. And it's bad for the kid. It was bad that it was kind of accepted that it was okay to leave your credentials out.
So have a way to do forensics or postmortem. Does your company have a critical response team? If not, if you're large enough, you probably need to get one. I'm fairly sure SpaceX has one. Yes, Robert? Do you have a critical response team at SpaceX? Yeah. Yep. A couple, maybe 10, 12 years ago, I decided to put together, I'm going to go through this really quickly, a list of prohibited software that we were blocking using Jamf, what's called Jamf restricted processes. And this is up still on Jamf Nation. You can take a look at it. It's like 50 or 60 things long. A lot of these are completely not legitimate. They don't even exist anymore, but this is about 10 years old. If you are responsible as a Jamf administrator in your education fleet, and you don't have a list like this in Jamf to block processes, you probably should start building one. Okay. Because those kids will download PDP software and hacking software and Metasploit framework and John the Ripper password cracking tools.
All right, zero trust. How many people here have implemented some level of zero trust network access or application access in their environments? Okay, just a couple of hands. Well, zero trust, the concept of zero trust is to say, well, I have zero trust. Just because the device is on my controlled network behind 2 levels of VPN, that still doesn't necessarily mean that that is a trustable device. So I will test a whole bunch of parameters, and based on the results of those parameters, make the determination whether or not that is a trustable device and that I can allow it to gain access to my environment, my resources, my data, whatever it is. So I see this coming in more from the enterprise side than the education side, but I think this is going to be pretty much just standard process as we move forward. So it requires a change in the way that we think about how we lay out endpoint and endpoint protection and networking and all that kind of stuff. So I have a quote up here, 2012, January 1st, 2012. This was published in Network World magazine because I had to come up with something really fast at a panel that I was on at Macworld Mac IT. And this person panned me in this article because I dared say that we have to stop thinking so much about the computers themselves, but we need to think about the data that we're trying to protect. 11 years later, that's kind of where we're at. So I stand by the quote that I made at the time. But this is going to be something that we are going to need to think about, probably first on the enterprise side, because we'll have the budgets to put it in place. But education, it's coming at you. Be aware. The good news is the enterprise will have spent the money with the vendors to figure out how to do it.
It'll be functional by the time it gets to you.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the simplest idea of zero trust networking is that nothing is trusted, everything is tested. And so we use a tool like Zscaler to pipe all that data.
And then NIST has some really fantastic, actual human readable information on this. I was actually really blown away by
the NIST population?
Yeah, this document was fantastic. If anybody here has participated in that or knows the people there, give them a good thumbs up and a pat on the back for me.
Hey, Adobe, computer labs still exist. Yes, they do. Now, it's gotten better. I admit it's gotten better, but it used to be a giant pain in the butt. You have a story about that?
Well, just curious here. How many people have had to implement Adobe or Adobe Creative Cloud or just Adobe apps prior to cloud or to
the federated login?
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you for sticking with this. Yeah. Because it was a disaster. But guess what? We are still doing this, mostly in education. Mm-hmm. And it is just a really good example. Well, the Creative Cloud is much, much better, and it's great. It's pretty easy. Just push it out. We're good now. But even up to a few years ago, it wasn't that simple. And that is something absolutely positively I only saw on education side.
So again, part of this presentation is kind of highlighting the differences and the commonalities between the two. So here's one that I will never see in corporate. It's just not part of my business. Here's one that's the other way around. Education does not have an executive IT support team, and yet every Fortune 500 I've ever talked to has an executive IT support team that sometimes operates completely out of bounds.
You might want to make your definition clear. What is your definition of an executive support team?
Yep, these are people that directly support senior leadership or C-level. The CEO, the CIO, the CTO. And like I said, sometimes they operate completely out of bounds of the rest of IT because they're working directly with senior leadership, and senior leadership gets what senior leadership wants, usually. Sometimes even outside of cybersecurity. Not often, but sometimes. I don't think I've ever seen this in education. I suppose if you're a big enough school, maybe. So,
Yeah,
you know,
I've got a couple of nods going through here.
okay. All right. Let's talk about data retention. In a corporate world, you have to retain data. And you have to have special rules around that data, how that data and how often, how long you hold on to that data. We have a policy at my company that was, I'm sure was put in place by legal, where we are only allowed a certain number of months of email in our email system. So after about 6 months or so, emails that I received or sent 6 months ago are automatically deleted for every single person in the company, unless they have an exception because they're senior leadership. That makes it difficult for somebody who had gotten kind of used to the habit of having years of email as a way to go back and look at something. If I'm not archiving that stuff, remembering to archive that email chain, it's gone. And the reason that was put in place by legal was because the company would be sued or they get into a legal battle, and that those emails from 3 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago were then requested by the opposing counsel during discovery, and it was used as a way to undermine the company's IP. And so legal went, all right, we're just going to make a policy that we don't hold on to email longer than 6 months. Which is, go ahead.
Yeah, so when you think of data retention policies, don't you usually think, oh my God, I need to hold on to this for 5 or for 7 years, 10 years, stuff like that? Has anybody actually thought about, no, I want to get rid of it as a policy so I can't have, or I don't deal with this? I'll be honest, I've never really seen that, except back in the day when there were still like POP servers for email, and it was just like we couldn't afford storage. It had nothing to do with legal or anything or stuff like that. When Damien was telling me about this, I was just like, say that again, because I couldn't believe that.
It was a very new concept for me, and I've kind of gotten used to it. But coming from education to enterprise, it was a whole different lens I had to look through. Data that's held on an endpoint, if that data is not in OneDrive, it doesn't exist. Period.
Which I actually kind of agree, not necessarily OneDrive.
Or
but
Box or Dropbox or whatever. If it doesn't exist in a cloud service and it's synchronized automatically, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And no one will do the data recovery. It's like part of our policy. We just don't do it. If you didn't save that data where you're supposed to save it, it doesn't exist.
Yep.
Data classification. So we deal with a lot of very sensitive intellectual property, and that data has to be classified. And so we have a policy using Microsoft Internet Information Protection, MIP, that labels data at different classification levels, all the way up to highly confidential. And there's some encryption happening in here too, like the highly confidential is also encrypted. So if the data is somehow exfiltrated, they can't get to it without the key. And so every Word file, every Excel file, everything that's generated on a machine has to have a label on it, even if it's a public basic label that means anybody can see it. And by enforcing that, we then have different levels of what gets backed up and how many times it gets backed up.
Anybody see that in education? No. Lots of no.
These are just a couple of tools that are out there. At Microsoft, information protection is one, Titus is another, and there's one called Terramind, which I don't have any experience with, but it does exist. The first two I do have experience with. Yep. Other commonalities, this is where we can ask the audience. Anybody who's been in both enterprise and education, do you have any other commonalities you can think about, things that are the same? How about hardware? Yes, no, sort of? How many of you are deploying fleets of MacBook Airs? About 15. How many of you are deploying fleets of MacBook Pros? The other half of the room.
Or maybe both.
Yeah, or okay, how about both? Yeah. Why?
Because they're cheaper.
No. Why are you deploying both? Why are you deploying both? Yeah. Yep. Costs. The right device for the right purpose. Yep. Thank you. That's what I was getting at. He said perception. Yep. Sometimes you have a person in senior leadership who just wants the most advanced, highest end machine they can get, whether they actually use it or not.
And they want the purple one.
Right. Yeah.
So who here in enterprise are deploying fleets of Chromebooks?
Oh, interesting. One person. Okay. No, it's all right.
Wow. Okay.
Because I see it in
I
education.
need to talk to you
everywhere.
about that because I'm
Yeah.
really curious.
I honestly thought that answer would be 0.
Yeah, that's what I was expecting. I thought that was a slam dunk.
Wow.
Got that wrong.
Yeah, let's talk
Thanks,
afterwards.
Mike.
Let's talk afterwards because I want to hear about that. Chromebooks are everywhere in education. They're nowhere in corporate that I've seen.
Except Mike's
Except,
place.
yeah, apparently except for Mike, yeah. So, you know.
Airbnb uses them a lot.
Oh, okay.
I was gonna say if Sam was here.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
See,
So
we're learning.
commonalities, right? Hardware, yes, right? You have to have different kind of personas of hardware, like who gets what, right? And we've defined those personas. We've said, you know, if you're doing this kind of work, you get this machine. If you're doing this kind of work, you get a MacBook Air, right? Is software the same? Yes and no, right? I've certainly been exposed to some software in the corporate world and I never saw in education, and vice versa. I'm not managing a learning management system.
Enterprise people, do you roll out Kahoot?
Nope.
Maybe on Chromebooks. I mean,
So
I would say that
let's use the catch box.
I would say that the pandemic accelerated. I'm guessing now, but the pandemic probably accelerated a trend for some companies that were remote work that had this corporate culture of monitoring employees, which we do for students and have never done for staff and faculty. And then similarly, you know, more aggressive web filters. You know, you need a much more aggressive filtering solution for kids with iPads
Right.
and non-technical folks versus, you know, educators. And so depending on the corporate culture and structure and missions and stuff, there could be some overlap in some departments and completely different things even within the same org.
So here's something. Software in corporate world, it costs more than the software, the exact same software in education. Sometimes by an order of magnitude. And so that's also something I've had to worry about and consider as I start to build program to say, I want to implement X software. I have to think about what is that going to cost and build that into my proposal.
yachts are expensive.
Yeah. Are the users the same? No. What if you're deploying a fleet of iPads to 6-year-olds? Do you think a 6-year-old is going to remember a password or even a PIN code to unlock that device? Because your cybersecurity team in your education department said, we're not going to put Google apps on that iPad unless it has a PIN code, because Google is enforcing that. Well, now you have a 6-year-old trying to use an iPad with a PIN code. So what do? Well, what did we do? We made the PIN code all the same, and we put the PIN code on a label, a sticky label, on the iPad, thereby completely making the cybersecurity policy, negating it, but solving the problem to get around the block that Google is. I don't have to worry about that in the corporate world.
Oh, you still have to worry about the credentials being stuck on the device.
So let me tell you a story. We have a security team that walks around our facilities, every one of our facilities, and I don't want to say it's every day, but it's often. And they look at people's cubicles and their desks, and if you've left something insecure, not secured, maybe you walked away from your computer and it was on, you didn't put it to sleep or whatever, they'll leave a little card on your desk that says, you've broken one of our security policies. Please don't let it happen again. And they keep a record of that.
Wow.
But by design, right? It's security. And so of course we do a lot of people do. We enforce, login window, sleep timeouts, login window timeouts. And I'll tell you another story, and this is physical security related. I was wandering around our research and design center that's 2 million square feet, and it's huge, it's enormous. It's super easy to get lost in because of the way they built it. And I thought, well, I need to get from this building to that building over there. Maybe that door is a hallway that gets me over there. Take my badge, bloop, red light. Like, guess not. Walked away and walked all the way around. The next day, I have a person from security at my desk going, how come you tried to badge into this room over in our research and design center? I'm like, oh, I was lost. I'm like, I was lost. I thought it was a shortcut. Okay, that's all right, fine. Don't let it happen again. They're tracking, right? Because, again, we're protecting those assets, protecting that intellectual property.
And they wanted to get more coffee, so your coffee was closer to the
We both use MDMs, right? Okay, so that's kind of one of the similarities. Now, how you use the MDM is a little bit different probably, but okay. We both use identity management. Azure, Okta, there's a bunch, right? Jump Cloud.
managed Apple IDs, right?
Managed Apple IDs, it's getting there. Some of the differences we've talked about already. Can anybody share differences they've seen? Somebody who's been in both education and enterprise. Anything else that we haven't come up with? Ask the audience. I should have put ask the audience up there.
Yeah.
Okay. Robert, who's got the cube? Right behind you there. Yep.
So a lot of times in corporate world in the summertime, people are on vacation. Doing projects.
That's coming up. Yeah, no,
then-
go ahead.
keep going,
Go
keep
ahead.
And then,
going.
yeah, and then, of course in the edu world, summertime is the time you get stuff done and ready for the next school
Yep.
year.
Right, right.
Yeah, actually, you're almost you're 2 slides away, Robert. Go ahead. No, you're good. You're good. Go ahead.
Does anyone else have like nothing gets done in December because like school ends? Yeah, school
Yes.
ends and then you got like a 2-week break and like that was always the joke for us is nothing gets done in September. So like we always told the project managers like just pretend you only have 11 months this year. Like
Yeah, and I see that across both. That is absolutely positively a both, because so many people manage to figure out how to, over like the Christmas break, extend it on both sides, because use it or lose it and stuff like that.
So here's a difference. The job titles between education and enterprise are, in my view, quite different. Let me give you some examples. Divisional VP of Analytics and Information Security.
Anybody have that title by any chance? Just
That's an actual title in corporate world.
they have really big business cards.
How do I get one of those jobs that aren't real where I send an email and then go to a meeting and then draft an email and then leave work and get paid $98,000 a year and have a badge on a little cord that says Senior Deputy Analytic Coordinator, Supervisor of Marketing and Sales, right? It's funny, it's a joke, but it's also real because we have people like that. This is a real job title I had when I worked at FIT. User Support Services Associate Level 2, right? How many?
Couldn't be on the first floor, couldn't be on
Right.
the third.
Yeah.
Kind of limited.
Right. I've seen titles like Clerk.
Yeah,
What is that person doing? I don't know.
clerking.
Okay.
My wife actually has the title of clerk.
Nice.
Clerk 2, actually, I think. It has nothing.
Yeah,
you
where's
don't want to
Clerk
know.
1? Yeah,
You don't
where's
want to
Clerk
know. Yeah, it has nothing to do with what she does. That's just the title.
Actual job title I had once. Okay. Robert jumped the gun. Thank you. It's okay. Summertime in education is different than summertime in enterprise. You do infrastructure changes. You do device reimaging or refreshing. You make policy changes. Some schools rewrite their AUP every year or two. Right? Their acceptable use policy.
You have fights with the building people because they decided to turn the air conditioning off.
Yeah.
Or you can't get into certain rooms
Yeah.
because they're stripping and waxing the floors.
You do repairs, right? Sometimes if you're in education, your computers will sit there waiting for repair for months and months and months until the summer when you have the time to finally repair them or mail them off or whatever you decide to do. Summertime in enterprise. I'm kidding. Summers don't exist in the enterprise except for August. August is this magical time in the corporate world where everybody goes on vacation. Certainly all of senior leadership does for the most part. So what does this mean for July? When I go check my work phone, there's going to be like 500 messages on it. because July is, oh my God, we're going to go really, really fast to get everything done so we can go on vacation in August. Just some pictures, because I like pictures. I think they're entertaining and educational and illustrative. These are some pictures from my time in education. We would do a 3-year rotation of laptops, and so we'd pull 1,000 laptops in, we'd push 1,000 laptops out, including data migration between the old fleet and the new fleet.
All right, I just want to point something out, difference education versus enterprise, because even in enterprise, you might have a sign like this, maybe, depending on situation, except that it would have been done by the graphic arts department, and it would have been this beautifully done, printed on a wide bed printer. So.
$200 banner, fabric banner.
Yeah, exactly. Education, you get some like 8.5 by 11 letter size that's been taped together.
I'm almost certain that was done by a student, like one of our student helpers, right? Which is fine. It served its purpose for the week or two we were doing the work. You see this kind of thing, which I don't see in corporate world, right? 1,000 computers we need to build out. What does it look like when you've got 1,000 laptops ready to go?
Actually, let me pause just for a second.
Yep.
Probably the biggest thing, as somebody who has been involved with both sides, I've worked with some very, very large companies, and they'll do a rollout, or they'll do a forklift upgrade, or there's something like that. And maybe in one office, they are just sweating it because they have to distribute 120 computers. And if you talk to them about education, they're kind of dismissive, quite honestly, sometimes, except for the people who've done education. Because school districts will deal with this. They may have 10,000 devices that they're dealing with every summer. 10,000. It could be 100,000 in a large city school district. You know, maybe not 100,000, but tens of thousands. So sometimes, for those of us who have done enterprise also, and they're sweating doing 120 devices, you just want to pat them back. I think it will be okay. So that is a huge difference that I see. The scale of device numbers is just out of this world different.
So we struggled to find space at our school big enough to even hold all of this equipment. And this happens to be the band room. I'm sorry, the music room, excuse me, the chorale room, right? It wasn't being used in the summertime, so we're going to use that space. And then the previous one was the band room back here, this one. And sometimes we do both. Like this is, you know, prepping and imaging right here, right? And migration, and then this is ready for pickup. I went the wrong way. Okay. Pallets. I learned how to drive a pallet jack. I'm very, very good at it. Not a skill I thought I would ever have, but
See, now if you were at like a really, really large school, it would have been a forklift.
I've driven a forklift, but not for this job.
No.
Other pictures are illustrative. Like I don't have to deal with iPad carts, right? I don't have this. Which is a teacher saying, "Hey, that's a really nice cart. I'm going to put my my 1960s overhead slide screen projector on it."
They have their 16 millimeter projector on another cart.
Yeah, and of course it's funny, right? That's why I put it in here because it's humorous and illustrative because that's a legitimate actual picture from a couple of years ago. Okay. I do have some pictures from Enterprise, not as many because I've only been there 2 years. Yes, this is a laptop that came in. It fell down in the space behind the recliner, slipped down, and then they opened the recliner. And it went, I'm going to bend this way.
When I saw this, I wasn't quite sure what I was looking at initially. It took a couple glances before I'm like, oh.
Yeah, accidental, right? Okay, well, it's a total loss, right? Here's another one. And then the one on the left is probably a drop. I'm not sure. That's... Oh, that's our headquarters. You don't have this in education, right? You have crazy headquarters, and I talked about our 2 million square foot research and design center. It's the size of a university. It's just enormous.
Actually, if we probably did a aerial of Penn State.
Yeah, that's bigger than this. Yeah, if you did all of Penn State stuff, but this is 2 million square feet. It's about 12 or 13 buildings all jumbled together. And I get lost in there every time I go. Yeah, people actually work here. In fact, my desk is right back, like over here to the left. You know, just cube world, right? But, you know, I'm not all the time in there. I work from home sometimes. Sometimes I'm over in HQ. Sometimes I'm up in the Research Design Center. Sometimes I'm on the factory floor. Any final thoughts?
I want to hear what everybody has to say.
Okay. So that's really final thoughts and Q&A.
I just, something I always found intriguing about my past life was you were talking about protecting the network and stuff like that from students and whatnot. And ours was always interesting because we had a wide open Class B network for the whole college. And it was always interesting to talk to vendors because they're like, oh, you just put it behind your NAT. And we had to explain to them we didn't have a NAT, we had public IPs. But then to increase the interesting factor, we actually opened a cybersecurity institute on campus. So like we built a whole brand new building, 3 floors, that kind of thing. And like that's their job, is to learn cyber. So like we had to protect ourselves from the people that were toying with like all the exfiltration tools and stuff like that on our campus, on our public network. So like it was always an interesting challenge that like you wouldn't normally get at most colleges. So just I wanted to share that earlier. And
That's interesting. Wide open Class C public IP network.
Class
Oh,
B.
Class B.
Yeah.
Class B.
65,000.
That's a lot of IP numbers.
Yeah.
Like
I mean,
public facing.
Yeah, eventually we like the wireless had to go behind the NAT and stuff like that. But like for the like my computer labs, like I had computer lab. I was actually, this is still being recorded, so no one, whatever.
I once heard.
I once heard, yes, thank you, that there was a challenge from a certain cloud storage company that if you submitted a form from a unique IP address, you could get an increase in storage. And luckily, I had a few computer labs
wow,
with unique
okay.
IP addresses that I could send, or that someone could allegedly send scripts out to. And so, but yeah,
12 petabytes of data in Google. In Google. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
so
He actually is AWS now.
Yeah.
So it was always just interesting challenges because, like, and that's just it. Is like I don't know that there's many people out there that aren't, most of their network behind a net and stuff like that. And we actually had to properly configure like Windows firewalls on the Windows side because there was a need for that. So yeah.
Wow.
Any questions for somebody who's been in I've been in, K-12, public,
I think we have one
higher
back
ed,
there.
corporate. I've seen pretty much everything except government at this point.
So I currently work for higher education, and something for central IT, something that the CIO would always say is, I don't want you guys using open source software, but the colleges or departments were allowed to use it. And then in 2018, I saw a presentation at Linux Fest where they talk about Blameware, or security theater, where CIOs are open to using like products from companies such as Microsoft or Red Hat, but they don't want to take the blame if there's a security breach by using open source software. Yeah. So there were some presenters here or some people in the community that were asking me, why don't we use open source software? So I try to explain that concept to them, but it seems like they didn't understand. But they work in the corporate environment, whereas I work in higher education. So do you encounter any problems with using open source software?
Yeah, so earlier I said, and I'll repeat it, every piece of open source software we deploy on our computers has to be vetted by our cybersecurity team, our information security team, and our multi-cloud and toolchain team. And those are the programmers and developers. Without that vetting, it doesn't get deployed. And then someone also has to be the product owner of that piece of software. And so, for instance, when I deployed Paul Bowden's Office Reset, I'm now the owner of that piece of software. Now that's relatively simple, super easy, not hard to support, but we're also deploying things like Kubernetes clusters, right, in our multi-cloud teams. I'm not managing that. We have a couple of employees who are the kube managers. Or Docker. We were using Docker, and then they changed their licensing model, and now we don't use Docker anymore.
Okay.
So, to answer your question, yes, I've absolutely seen it. There is some resistance sometimes, but we've hired people to manage that process and be the product owners of those tools.
One other thing that I'm curious about the corporate environment is for a lot of job postings, one thing I see is unlimited PTO, whereas in higher education, we get a certain amount of hours, but they accrue over time, but then you got to use it or lose it.
Yeah.
So for example, I get 440 hours, up to 440 hours that I could accrue, but if I go over that, I lose it.
Yeah,
So
this
how
is,
does unlimited PTO work?
Yeah, so this is probably where it varies based on the company. I don't think we can say all Fortune 500s have this unlimited PTO. It's just not true. But what we do have is, in my case, and most of the companies I've seen, we have a little bit of flexibility in that PTO. So it's not really tracked except by your manager. And so if your manager says, hey, you can have that time off, you can have that time off. And so the responsibility falls on that management structure. It's not tracked or accounted for in any way that I can see.
But it's a great way of getting that job that pays $98,000 that you
There
don't
you go,
need
yeah,
to do because
yeah.
you just take
Yeah.
PTO for the entire year.
And that's different because when I was in education, I did have that. I did have, accrual time, time that was accrued PTO. In fact, when I left FIT, I got a check for the PTO that I didn't use. So, which I was like, oh, that's a nice surprise.
That's why unlimited PTO exists, because there is no quota to pay you for when you leave.
Interesting. Hadn't thought about that.
Can you give him the box and say that again for the record? No, because it's an important point.
I believe the reason unlimited PTO exists so that they don't need to pay you out for any accrued days because there is no accrued amount of days.
Yeah, and I think the reality of what is unlimited PTO, it is not truly unlimited. It is
Right.
what your managers and supervisors are willing to allow you to have because they have to make sure that goals are met, deadlines are met, that type of thing. And if you're not meeting your deadlines, it's unlikely that they're going to give you the paid time off.
So what I didn't talk to in this presentation, but we have a minute or two here, I didn't talk at all in this presentation about work from home. It's changing. Someone said it earlier, I think COVID has forced HR departments to recognize that we don't necessarily all have to come into an office every single day. And my company has, I think, reluctantly started to understand that. And HR has had to be a little bit more flexible on job offers and who's working from home and who's getting full-time remote work. Even while sometimes there are forces within the company resisting that, because we do have a lot of space that we're still paying for, that we own, that probably should be filled with people working, but they're working at home. So one of my goals with platform agnostic IT is to get as many machines, in my case, Apple machines, into people's hands, regardless of where they work, whether they're at home or in person. And if I can get zero touch built, I'm close, then it means it's that much less work that has to happen on site because people are fully remote. And we have this distributed workforce, increasingly distributed workforce around the world. So.
Any other thoughts, comments, questions?
Yep. We got 3 minutes.
So I'm curious to know about your thoughts on salary. So public sector education, I heard the salaries are pretty low, the compensation, and corporations do probably pay more. But I also want to know your thoughts about the stress level and the work-life balance and stuff that comes with, and more responsibility that comes with the higher pay.
Yes, that is an excellent question. I am more stressed now than I was working in education, but I'm paid better. So those are both true. But I've also been able to move to a town where I can afford to buy a house. I left a high cost of living area, and now I live in an area where I can afford to own a house. And so from that aspect, I'm way less stressed. So work stress is much higher. Home stress life is way lower. And
You
so
still don't have an ice machine, though.
No. For those of you who know me, one of my dreams, and this is going to be now on the public record, thank you, Ben.
You're welcome.
One of my dreams,
It was actually a
Is-
slide in my presentation I didn't get.
one of my
shown.
dreams, life goals, is to have a Manitowoc hotel ice maker in my garage. I know, it's weird, but it's who I am. I love ice. Love, love, love ice. And my wife rolls her eyes every time I talk about it. But one day I will have a Manitowoc ice maker, or maybe one of the under-counter ones, but an ice maker that's not just the one in the fridge. So all my friends that are on Facebook and all like, oh God, Damien's talking about ice makers again. Like, you made a subreddit about it, and they're like, yes, I made a subreddit about ice makers. Okay, now it's on the public record. Thanks, man.
You're welcome.
Now, I'm in good humor.
Glad to help.
Yeah, we're all unique individuals. We all have unique experiences. That's why I like this conference so much, is we get to see this really broad variety of people talking about a broad variety of things. So we do have feedback. I please ask you to fill it out. Negative, positive, or other. Love to hear what you guys have to say.
Great.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you.